The wind howled like a wounded beast outside, rattling the windows and groaning against the wooden walls of Ethan Carter's cabin. The snowstorm had transformed the Alaskan wilderness into a white void, roads erased, trees bent under the weight of ice, the world outside frozen in time. Ethan sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, his fingers curled around a lukewarm cup of coffee. He was used to the isolation. He had chosen it. Out here, there was no noise, no one to bother him. Just the quiet hum of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind. But then, scratch. A sound. He stiffened. His eyes flicked toward the door. Scratch, thud. This time, it wasn't the wind. Something was outside. Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his cup down. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall and rose to his feet. No one should be out here, not in this storm. As he crept toward the door, his pulse drummed in his ears. Through the frost-coated peephole, he could barely make out the swirling snow. Then, a shadow. Something large. Ethan's breath caught. He wiped the condensation from the peephole with his sleeve and peered through again. A bear. A massive grizzly barely visible in the blizzard. His grip on the rifle tightened. This wasn't good. If it was starving, it could be dangerous. Then he saw them, 3 cubs, huddled near the mother's legs, barely clinging to life. And that was when Ethan noticed something worse. The bear wasn't moving right. She swayed, her breathing ragged, her fur caked in ice. Too thin, too weak. His stomach clenched. Bears shouldn't be out this time of year. If she was awake during hibernation season, something had gone horribly wrong. Then, one of the cubs collapsed. The mother nudged it weakly with her nose, but the little one didn't stir. Something twisted deep in Ethan's gut. He should ignore them. Let nature take its course. But then the mother bear lifted her head, and their eyes met. Ethan's breath hitched. There was no aggression, no rage, no wild instinct, just pleading. The bear whimpered. His grip tightened on the rifle. Bears don't whimper. Then she collapsed. Her body slammed against the porch, legs buckling under her weight. Ethan stood there, frozen. His brain screamed at him to walk away, to lock the door, to do what every survival instinct told him to do. But his legs carried him forward instead. His hand gripped the door handle. This was insane. This was suicide. But as he heard the storm's fury screaming outside, as he looked at the half-dead cubs curled up against their dying mother, Ethan Carter did something he would never be able to take back. He opened the door. The wind slammed into him, cold knives against his skin. The mother bear barely lifted her head, her breath shallow. The cubs hesitated before stumbling forward, pressing against her for warmth. Ethan stepped back, the rifle still in his hands. The bear didn't attack. She crawled forward, weak, exhausted, and lowered herself onto the wooden floor. The cubs followed, their tiny bodies barely moving. Ethan shut the door. The storm roared outside. Inside, the only sound was the crackling fire and the slow, labored breathing of a dying bear. He had saved them, or maybe he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Ethan backed away slowly, the rifle firm in his grip, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal. The massive grizzly lay in the center of his cabin, her breath coming in shallow, uneven puffs. The cubs were curled tightly against her, their tiny bodies trembling from cold and exhaustion. The fire cast flickering shadows across the wooden floor, the storm still raging outside, but inside, it was silent. Too silent. Ethan had let in a wild predator. He had let in hunger, and hunger has no loyalty. His fingers tightened around the rifle stock. What the hell had he done? The mother bear made no move to attack, no sign of aggression. She was too weak, too close to the edge. Her ribs pressed sharply against her fur, her eyes dull and sunken. She looked like she had been starving for weeks, if not longer. But it was the wounds that caught his attention. Her body wasn't just thin, it was damaged. Patches of fur were missing, revealing raw, inflamed flesh beneath. Along her back and sides, her skin was pockmarked with honeycomb-like lesions, some oozing, others crusted over in sickly yellow scabs. Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen frostbite before. He had seen starvation before. This wasn't either of those. This was something else. One of the cubs let out a weak whine and nuzzled against its mother's side. She didn't react. She was barely clinging to consciousness. Ethan lowered his rifle slightly. The longer he stood there, the more he realized something horrifying. They weren't just starving, they had been running. From what? He shook the thought away. First things first. He moved cautiously to the fireplace, watching the bears from the corner of his eye. His hands worked on instinct, grabbing the chunk of venison he had stored from his last hunt, slapping it onto a cast iron pan. The sizzle of cooking meat filled the cabin. The moment the scent hit the air, the cubs lifted their heads. The mother twitched. Ethan took a step back, rifle still in his grasp. He wasn't an idiot. Food meant survival. Survival meant instinct. And instinct was unpredictable. One of the cubs, the weakest one, tried to stand but collapsed almost immediately. The second cub crawled toward its mother and buried its nose into her fur, desperate for warmth. The third, the strongest one, lifted its head, sniffed the air, and then looked directly at Ethan. The fire crackled, the meat hissed. Ethan didn't move. Then, suddenly, the mother bear opened her eyes. The movement was slow, deliberate, tired, but her gaze locked onto him. A surge of cold washed over Ethan, something instinctual, something primal. He knew that look. It was the look of something that would do anything to survive. His pulse pounded in his ears. His grip on the rifle tightened, just in case. The mother bear tried to rise. Her limbs trembled violently, her muscles struggling against their own decay. But then, her legs gave out, and she collapsed again. A soft whimper. Weak, hopeless. Ethan exhaled. He wasn't in danger, not from her, not like this. He took the venison off the fire and moved carefully toward them. The mother bear didn't react. The strongest cub, though, it did. As Ethan knelt down, placing the steaming meat on a plate just a few feet away, the cub stared at him. Its body was weak, but its eyes were sharp, intelligent. Then, slowly, it moved. Cautiously, shakily. Step by step, it approached the food. Ethan held his breath. The cub sniffed the venison, its nose twitching. Then, it hesitated. Ethan frowned. Why isn't it eating? The cub turned to look at its mother, then back at the food. It let out a tiny strangled sound, somewhere between a growl and a cry. Ethan's stomach twisted. It wasn't going to eat until she did. The mother bear was too weak to move. Ethan clenched his jaw. If she didn't eat soon, she was going to die. The storm outside screamed against the cabin walls, but inside, all Ethan could hear was his own breathing and the sound of something breaking inside him. He grabbed the plate and moved forward, too close now. If she attacked, he wouldn't have time to react. But she didn't. She didn't even flinch. Ethan set the plate down right in front of her. He waited. The bear's breath was slow, strained. Then she twitched. Her nose moved, her mouth opened slightly. And then, with a pained effort, she ate. Ethan sat back, his hands shaking. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to breathe. But that relief was short-lived, because as the mother bear ate, as the cubs began licking the remaining grease from the plate, Ethan noticed something in the dim firelight. Her wounds. The deep honeycomb-like sores, the way they pulsed slightly, the sickly ooze that leaked from their edges. This wasn't frostbite. This wasn't malnutrition. This was something else. And then, the smallest cub let out a soft, rattling cough. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. Something was wrong. Something far worse than hunger. Something that might already be inside his cabin. And for the first time since opening that door, Ethan wondered if he had just let death inside. Ethan sat frozen in place, the heat of the fire licking against his skin. But all he felt was cold. His eyes were locked onto the mother bear's wounds, those sickly honeycomb-like lesions that oozed with a slow, unnatural secretion. His gut twisted with the kind of dread that settled deep. The kind that whispered this wasn't just sickness. This wasn't just starvation. This was something else. The weakest cub coughed again, a frail, rattling sound that made Ethan's hair stand on end. It was a sound of something already too far gone. He had let them in. And now it was inside his cabin. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the wooden floor. The mother bear chewed weakly, her head lowering with exhaustion. The strongest cub, the one that had looked at him with almost human intelligence, stared again. But this time, its gaze wasn't just one of hunger or fear. It was knowing. Ethan's stomach clenched. What the hell had happened to them? A sickness? A parasite? Had something been eating them alive from the inside out? He had seen diseased animals before, but this was wrong. His pulse pounded in his ears. His hands itched to grab his rifle, not out of fear, but out of an overwhelming instinct to protect himself. But from what? The bears weren't acting aggressive. They weren't acting like animals in distress. They were just watching him, waiting. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. His body screamed against it, his instincts roaring for him to run, to leave, to burn the cabin to the ground if he had to. Instead, he crouched lower, looking at the smallest cub. It was the weakest of the three, smaller than it should have been. Its breathing was shallow, its fur thin. It wasn't just dying, it had been dying for a while. And then he saw it, something writhing beneath its skin. Ethan's heart stopped. For a second, he thought it was a trick of the firelight, but no. There was movement beneath the cub's fur, a slow, unnatural shifting, like something was inside. Ethan recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. Number, no, no, no. He had made a mistake. He had let something infected inside his home. His mind raced through possibilities, mange, parasites, some kind of flesh-eating disease, but nothing explained that movement. Nothing explained the honeycomb-like wounds, the way they pulsed as if they were growing. He needed to get them out. Now, he stood too fast, the sudden movement causing the mother bear to shift slightly, her lifeless gaze following him. The strongest cub watched too, unblinking. Ethan grabbed his coat, his boots, his rifle. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to leave. But then, the cub's ribs moved. Not from breathing, from something beneath its skin pressing outward. A shudder ran through Ethan. His hands trembled. This wasn't a bear cub anymore. It was a shell, and whatever was inside was ready to come out. The weakest cub let out a sound that wasn't a whimper or a growl or a cry. It was a choking gurgle. Then, its body convulsed. Ethan took a step back, his stomach lurching. The bear cub began to seize violently, its small limbs jerking unnaturally, its mouth foaming. The mother bear let out a weak, guttural noise. Not a growl, not a cry, something mournful. But she didn't move to help. She just watched. The other two cubs pressed closer against her. Then, with a sickening crack, the smallest cub's chest bulged outward. Ethan's body went cold. The thing beneath its skin pushed harder. The skin tore. Ethan took another step back, horror twisting inside him. Something was coming out. A long, black, glistening limb pushed through the torn flesh, jagged and slick with blood. Ethan choked back bile. He couldn't breathe. The cub shuddered once more, then went still. Dead. A slow, sickening silence filled the room. The fire crackled. The storm howled. Ethan gripped the rifle so hard his knuckles turned white. The mother bear didn't react. The remaining cubs didn't react. They just stared. Ethan took another step back. His heart pounded so violently he could barely hear. The thing inside the cub twitched. Then slowly it began to move. Ethan turned and ran. He didn't stop to grab his pack. He didn't stop to grab supplies. He just ran. And behind him, the mother bear finally moved. A slow, deliberate shift. Her sickly, hollowed eyes locked onto him. Ethan reached the door, yanked it open, the cold nearly blinding him. He didn't care. He threw himself into the storm, the wind swallowing him whole. And just as the door slammed shut behind him, he swore he heard something inside the cabin click, a sound no bear should ever make, a sound that wasn't human either, a sound that said the nightmare wasn't over. It was only beginning. Ethan ran. His boots punched into the thick snow, his breath came in ragged gasps, and the wind screamed around him, a feral, merciless force. The storm had swallowed the forest whole, turning every tree into a twisted, shifting silhouette. But the cold wasn't the only thing chasing him. Behind him, something moved inside the cabin. A slow, deliberate shift of weight, then a click. Not from the door, not from wood shifting. Something else. Something not human, not animal. Ethan didn't stop. He didn't dare. The storm was his only ally now, his only chance. But the snow was deep, the wind blinding. his lungs burned, his hands were already going numb, and he had no supplies, no compass, no sense of direction. He was going to freeze to death, or something worse. A low, dragging sound echoed behind him, almost lost in the wind. They were moving. The mother bear, the cubs, or what was left of them. Ethan swallowed a scream and pushed forward, legs burning, chest heaving. He wasn't built for this kind of cold, not without gear, not without backup. He was running blind, and he knew it. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He could not let them catch him. He didn't know how long he ran. Minutes, maybe hours. Time blurred into a mindless, survival-driven haze. But then, he saw something. A clearing ahead, a ridge, and just beyond it, the frozen river. Salvation. His cabin was miles away from the nearest town, but if he could make it across the river, he could follow the frozen bank toward civilization, toward people, toward help. But as he stumbled forward, he nearly tripped over something half buried in the snow. A corpse. Number, not just one, dozens. Scattered across the clearing like discarded trash, their bodies frozen solid, their limbs twisted in grotesque positions. Old hunters, trappers, hikers. People who had gone missing years ago. Ethan's stomach lurched. This wasn't just a few lost souls. This was a graveyard. And at the center, the bones. Towering over the frozen corpses, a massive ribcage jutted out of the snow. Not a bear, not a moose. Something bigger, older, wrong. A skeleton of something that shouldn't exist. The bones were hollowed out, honeycombed, like the mother bear's wounds. Ethan's breath hitched, his entire body locked in place. This was where it had started. And then he heard it. The sound of something wet and heavy sliding through the trees. Not running, not stalking, moving, expanding, growing. The cubs, the mother, or what they had become. Ethan turned slowly and saw them. They stood at the edge of the clearing, just shadows against the howling storm. But they weren't bears anymore. The mother was taller now, her limbs longer, her wounds pulsing. The cubs, what was left of them, moved wrong. Their bodies twisted, reshaped, no longer fur and bone, but something else. Something that came from the dead thing buried beneath the ice. Ethan's mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't move. Not when the mother finally spoke. Her voice wasn't a growl. It wasn't a sound any living thing should have made. It was inside his head. It was ancient, hungry, hollow, and it whispered one word: join. Ethan snapped. His instincts roared, drowning out the terror, drowning out the numbness, drowning out the madness creeping into his skull. He turned and ran for the frozen river. The ice cracked beneath his feet. His boots skidded against the slick surface, each step a gamble. He could hear them behind him now, the wet, slick sound of bodies no longer bound by bones. Ethan didn't look back. He just ran. The ice creaked, his vision blurred, and then he heard it, a final snap. The ice gave way beneath him. The river swallowed him in whole. The cold was a knife to the chest. The current dragged him down instantly, wrapping around him like a vice. Ethan kicked, thrashed, fought. But something else was in the water, something waiting, something that had been watching. And just as his lungs screamed for air, something wrapped around his ankle, long, cold, hollow. And then, through the ice above, he saw them. The mother bear. The cubs. Standing at the edge of the river, watching, their faces no longer their own. Ethan's mind shattered. His screams vanished into the freezing dark. And then, there was nothing.